It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful late-night flight. I had a window seat on a half-empty plane, the kind of flight where you could almost spread out and relax. The lights had dimmed, and most passengers were either asleep or lost in their own thoughts, lulled by the hum of the engines. The only sounds were the occasional clicks of seatbelts being fastened or the soft rustling of newspapers. Then, I noticed him, sitting in the row across from me, directly across the aisle. A man who hadn't been there when I first boarded, a man whose presence now seemed somehow out of place. He wasn't old, maybe in his mid-30s, but something about his eyes, they were unsettling, cold, too focused. At first, I thought it was nothing. I'd seen my fair share of nervous flyers, but as the flight went on, his behavior became increasingly bizarre. He kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, almost as if he was trying to gauge whether I was watching him. Every few minutes, he would shift in his seat, readjusting his position, as though he couldn't find a comfortable place to settle. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe he was just a little anxious. Maybe I was overthinking things. But then he did something that sent a chill down my spine. The man reached into his bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped it open, but instead of writing or taking notes, he stared at the pages, his expression becoming more intense, as though whatever he was looking at was deeply disturbing. I couldn't make out the words from my seat, but it didn't matter. His eyes never left the pages, not even when the flight attendants passed by. That's when I noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the quick, shallow breaths he was taking. I tried to look away, hoping my gaze wouldn't draw attention. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. The man was clearly agitated, but there was no clear reason. No outward signs of distress, no crying or shouting, but the tension around him was palpable. At some point, the lights flickered, and the plane hit some mild turbulence. I heard a few nervous laughs from the other passengers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The man suddenly stood up, moving swiftly, too swiftly, and made his way to the restroom. It was odd, because there was no reason for him to get up. He hadn't touched his drink or made any attempt to get comfortable. As he passed, I caught a glimpse of his face. His expression was no longer anxious, but blank, cold, detached. And for a split second, I thought I saw something else in his eyes. Something predatory. Minutes later, he returned, but this time, he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood by the galley, watching the flight attendants as they moved about. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Then, the plane hit more turbulence. This time, it was stronger, shaking the entire cabin. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I heard it, a muffled sound, like something scraping across the floor, followed by a soft yet unmistakable whisper just behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The aisle was empty, save for the flight attendants who were hurriedly securing the cabin. But then, I saw something, a shadow moving swiftly past the curtains toward the back of the plane. I couldn't see who it was, but I knew it was him. I gripped the armrest, my pulse quickening, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. The plane shuddered again, this time even more violently, and I could feel the weight of something heavy bearing down on the air around me. A strange, almost suffocating pressure filled the cabin, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the turbulence stopped. The lights flickered once more and stayed on. The man was gone. The flight attendants moved past me like nothing had happened, and the other passengers were talking quietly, unaware. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest, searching for any sign of him. But there was no trace. No sign of the man who had been sitting directly across from me. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I was about to ask one of the flight attendants about it when I saw it. The notebook. It was lying on the floor near the back of the plane, its pages open. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I could barely breathe as I picked it up, knowing I shouldn't look inside. But I did. And what I saw inside that notebook was enough to freeze me in place. The last entry was a single sentence, written in uneven handwriting. "He's sitting next to you." Just then, the plane hit another jolt of turbulence, and the lights went out completely. It had been a long day of traveling, and I was exhausted. I had just missed my flight. The gate had closed minutes before I arrived, and no one seemed to care. The airport was eerily quiet, and the last thing I wanted was to wait around alone. The next available flight wasn't until the next morning, and I was forced to find a seat in the waiting area, surrounded by the haunting silence of the nearly empty terminal. As I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There were no other travelers in sight, and the usual bustle of the airport was replaced with an uncomfortable stillness. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the walls, and the air felt cold, too cold for the time of year. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, but there was no signal, nothing, not even Wi-Fi. It was as if the world outside this terminal had disappeared. I looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the place was still empty. No staff, no passengers, just me and the quiet hum of the terminal. I didn't want to admit it, but the isolation was starting to feel suffocating. Then, a strange noise interrupted my thoughts, a soft, almost inaudible rustling sound coming from down the hall. I looked up, my heart racing, but there was no one there, just the flickering lights. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just the sound of the building settling, but then it happened again, this time louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the empty terminal. My pulse quickened as I scanned the hallway. No one. No one visible. The footsteps continued, though, growing closer. I stood up, my stomach in knots, but still saw nothing. I hesitated. Was this real? Was I just tired, imagining things? I checked the time. Only 15 minutes had passed since I sat down. I couldn't explain it. The footsteps stopped. I sat back down, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to focus on my phone again, but a flicker in my peripheral vision caught my attention. At the far end of the terminal, a figure stood motionless, just outside the reach of the dim light. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. I could barely make out his features, but something about his stillness made my stomach lurch. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. I stared at him, frozen in place, and when I blinked, he was gone. A wave of panic swept over me. I wasn't imagining this. I knew it. I stood up again, this time to leave, but the airport seemed different now. The layout had shifted. What was once the food court was now just a row of empty chairs. The bathrooms I had passed earlier were now boarded up. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I turned back toward the terminal's exit, but the door wasn't where it should have been. That was when I realized I was trapped. The lights flickered again, and I could swear I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. I turned to face the direction of the sound, but there was no one there. My chest tightened as I took a step forward. With each step, the surroundings seemed to warp further, more shadows in places that shouldn't have been dark, just doors where there hadn't been any before. My mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. I was about to shout out for help when the floor beneath me suddenly shifted. I staggered, nearly losing my balance. The whole terminal seemed to groan, as if it was alive. Panic surged through me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just needed to get out of there. And then through the chaos of warped reality, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the terminal. This time, it wasn't a shadow. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her hands hanging limply at her sides. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her presence pressing in on me. My legs moved before I could stop them. I ran toward her, desperation driving me forward. The terminal stretched endlessly ahead, but I couldn't stop. I had to reach her. She was the only thing that felt real. As I got closer, I felt the temperature drop even more, my breath fogging in the air. I reached out, ready to scream, to demand answers, but just as I touched her arm, the lights went out completely. The entire terminal was plunged into darkness. In the suffocating silence that followed, I heard her voice, soft but unmistakable, "You're not supposed to be here." And then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I froze. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight home after a long business trip, just a quick stop to grab my luggage and head home. But as I approached the baggage claim, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The carousel was moving slowly, spitting out bags one by one, but my suitcase never appeared. I stood there, waiting, watching as each bag rolled by. After a while, I began to wonder if it was just delayed or maybe misplaced. I dealt with lost luggage before, so I figured it was no big deal. I went over to the customer service desk, filled out the required forms, and the agent reassured me that it would show up soon enough. I sat down to wait, thinking nothing of it. Hours passed, and still no sign of my bag. The airport was mostly empty by now. Most passengers had either left or were waiting for their next flight. The few who remained were in a rush to get home or occupied with their own issues. Growing increasingly uneasy, I decided to check with the Lost and Found office. As I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, I noticed an odd hum filling the air. It was quiet at first, almost like static, but it seemed to grow louder the further I went. When I reached the Lost and Found, the attendant greeted me kindly but informed me that they hadn't seen my bag. She suggested I check baggage claim once more. My frustration was beginning to give way to something darker, a sense that something was off, deeply off. I made my way back toward the baggage area, the hum now unmistakably louder, almost mechanical. As I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There it was, my suitcase, sitting alone in the middle of the carousel, as if it had been there the whole time. I couldn't believe my eyes. I approached it cautiously, glancing around the empty terminal. No one was in sight. The place felt too quiet, too still. I reached for my bag, the metal handle cold against my fingers. My breath caught as a strange sensation shot up my spine. Something wasn't right. I unzipped the suitcase, half expecting to find the clothes I'd packed. But instead, I found nothing, except for a small black envelope. My heart skipped a beat. I opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper on which was written in hastily scrawled handwriting, "I've been waiting for you." A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the suitcase shut, my mind racing. The hum had grown into a loud, almost deafening noise now, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked around frantically, but the terminal was still empty, too empty. I grabbed my bag and rushed toward the exit, my pulse pounding in my ears. The noise followed me, growing louder with every step, until I reached the door and burst into the fresh air outside. But just as I stepped out, I heard something I wasn't prepared for. A voice, clear as day, coming from behind me. "We're not done yet." I turned around, but there was no one there. The night air felt cold against my skin, and I realized with a sinking feeling that whatever had been waiting for me had followed me out of the airport. I didn't know who or what was behind it, but I was certain I wasn't going to escape it so easily.